How to edit your book after the first draft. Is it ready to be published? Should you send it off right away? What do you have to do to your book after you have finished writing your first draft to make it the best book it can be? We're going to be dealing with those questions and more, and we're starting right now. What is the difference between a professional writer and an amateur writer? An amateur writer will write his book, finish the first draft, write the end, and quickly send it off to a literary agent as fast as possible. Whereas a professional writer will write their book, finish the first draft, and understand that it is nothing more than a draft, not finished, but just the first draft of many. And when you write a draft, you're just simply telling yourself the story. It's like putting together a puzzle. You've just simply put the pieces of the puzzle on the table. Now the process begins of putting the puzzle together. An amateur writer will finish the first draft and without even doing a spell check, send it off to a literary agent as fast as possible. And it's understandable. They're excited. They want to see their book in a bookstore as fast as possible. The problem is that it's not ready. They believe it is. They have that energy. They want to get that book published. But the problem is that your first draft is just one draft of many. Ask any successful writer, and they will tell you that they rewrote their book 4 or 5 times completely from the first to the 5th draft. An amateur writer doesn't like rewriting. They find it boring. They want to move on to the next story. They want to write something as fast as possible and then move on to the next story and have their first book published within weeks of sending it to a literary agent. The problem is that's not how it happens. When you finish your first draft, that is when you simply put it away and then you start your next story, but you don't send it to anyone. You leave it for about a few weeks or a month, and then you come back to it and read it with a fresh pair of eyes. You read it as though you're reading someone else's work. And this is the secret to being a successful editor. You want to become an editor within your own mind. You want to be able to look at your book as though someone else wrote it. That's not easy, because when you're writing, it's like being inside of a maze. You don't know to go left or right. Your story might be wandering all over the place, and you wouldn't know. Because as a writer, it's hard to tell whether or not you're writing a good story. But when someone else reads it, they can spot your mistakes right away. If your characters are weak, if the story is weak, if the story is slow, a professional editor will notice that right away and give you suggestions, telling you that your story is slow. Now, as a writer, you might think it's fine, but someone else reading it will notice. And the goal is a professional writer has the ability to see their own work as though they are a professional editor. They can judge themselves harshly. They know when rereading their book after a few weeks, when the story begins to slow down. They can sense it. It's like a comedian who writes jokes when they're alone in their living room. They know whether or not the audience is going to laugh. They have this ability. Successful comedians have this ability to simply know whether or not a joke is going to be successful. They can sense it. Whereas an amateur comedian will just come up with a joke and just think it's okay and then say it in front of a live audience and no one laughs. Whereas a professional comedian would know if the joke is going to work. As a new writer, you want to develop the ability to be an editor within your own mind, to look at your own work as though someone else has written it. You want to be able to tell pacing, character development, the character arc. You want to be able to know from an honest point of view. You can't just look at your own work and believe that it's great. You have to look at it from an honest point of view as though someone else has written it. Because a professional writer knows that your first draft is one of many. And chances are, when you write your book, you're going to find your characters on the last page. You can write 500 pages, but it's only on the last page that you truly understand your characters. A professional writer will go back and rewrite the entire book with those fresh characters in mind. So the characters are real, powerful, and people you can relate to from page one. Now, a professional writer knows that when you start a novel, your characters are weak at the beginning, but they get stronger and more real as you go, to a point where when you get to the end of the novel, that's when your characters are, that's when they're the most real. An amateur writer will write weak characters at the beginning and come up with strong characters at the end, but then just leave it. They will send that to a literary agent. And the literary agent's going to read your book, and they're going to see weak characters at the beginning. And they're not going to have any motivation to want to read on because your characters are weak. Whereas a professional writer knows that if you come up with your characters at the end, they go back and rewrite the beginning and the middle with those strong characters in mind. So that way the characters seem rich and powerful from page one. And when you walk into a bookstore and you pick up one of those books, you are amazed at how powerful and real and complex the characters are right from the beginning. And you think, how could someone write a novel like this? How can someone come up with characters that are so real and powerful right at the beginning? The fact is, the writer did not have those rich, powerful characters right from the page one. In fact, those characters were probably weak in the beginning. But the writer found their characters at the end, but they went back and rewrote the beginning and the middle with those strong characters, making it appear as though the characters, as though they knew their characters right from page one, but they didn't. The characters were weak at the beginning, strong at the end, but they went back and rewrote the novel for a second and third, or possibly the fourth time. If the pacing is weak, they're able to go back and rewrite the entire novel from the beginning with a stronger pacing. An amateur is going to read their own book, realize that the pacing is weak about at the middle, and they might make a few changes here or there to try to speed up their novel. But that's not going to work, because if your pacing is all off from the beginning, that means you have to go back and rewrite the novel from the beginning. Amateurs don't like rewriting. They find it annoying. They don't have that passion, the energy, like they did when they were writing the first draft. A professional is the same way. They have that passion and energy to write their first draft, but then they realize that the characters are weak, the pacing is weak, so they realize they have to go back and rewrite the entire novel. They don't want to, because they don't have that same passion, but they realize it's needed. And that's the difference between a professional and an amateur. It all comes down to rewrites. And an editor will give you advice to make your novel better. And a professional will take that advice because they know that that editor knows what they're talking about. Whereas an amateur, they don't want advice. They want to just hand the book off to a friend of theirs who's going to read it and say, yeah, it's great, I loved it. But the question is, does your friend really know about novel editing? This is the problem when you have friends read your book. They tell you your book is great, and then you send it off to a publisher who rejects it because your friend means well. They did like it, but they're not professional editors. It's like asking your friend to fix a transmission on your car. They might want to, but do they truly know how to fix a transmission? Whereas if you took your transmission to a professional, they would be able to fix it properly. When you ask friends and family to read your book, they might give you a false sense of security, where you believe your book is finished and ready for publication. You then send it to a literary agent who rejects it immediately. This is why you have to develop the ability to be an editor within your own mind, to see your own book as though someone else has written it. You don't want to be stuck inside the maze of writing your book. You want to be able to step back and see the maze from the outside, to know to go left or right. Because when you hover above a maze, you can pretty much tell to go left or right, how to get to the end. But when you're in the maze, you don't know if going left or right is the right decision. Amateur writers are stuck in the maze. Professional writers have the ability to pull themselves out of the maze and see it from above. They can see their own book as though someone else has written it. And they know which way to go. They know how to fix it. Another big problem when writing your first book is amateurs like to put themselves into their book. They like to make themselves the protagonist. A professional writer knows to separate themselves from their characters. The characters are free to do what they need to do in order to solve the problem they're in. An amateur writer will have the protagonist doing what they would do in real life to solve a problem. And the problem is your protagonist ends up being a very weak, passive character who doesn't put themselves into danger, because you as a writer would never put yourself into danger, which makes sense. But a professional writer knows that if you want to be successful, you have to separate yourself from your protagonist and all the characters. So that way, your characters are free to do what they need to do in order to solve the problem. Because if you put yourself into all of your books, it becomes very predictable on how the protagonist is going to solve the problem. Because they're just solving the problem the way you would. And that's not what you want to do as a writer. Another problem with writing as an amateur that you may not realize that an editor would point out is you're not using the 5 senses. You're using this sense of sight, and you're describing what you see, but you're not describing what you smell, what you taste, what you can feel, what emotions are going through the protagonist. You're just using one basic, the sense of being what you can see. Whereas a professional writer knows that you have to go beyond that. You have to use all 5 senses to make the scene real. And an editor will point this out to you right away. They will point out to you as an amateur that you're not using all 5 senses to make the scene real. So as an amateur, you want to be able to read your scene and ask yourself, are all 5 senses being incorporated into this scene to make this scene real and powerful? So remember, the ability to step back from your own work and to see it as though someone else has written it, and be honest with yourself. Imagine if you were an editor and the book that was handed to you was written by a complete stranger. Even though it's your book, you have to read it as though someone else has written it and be able to point out the mistakes. But you can't be nice and say that the book is amazing simply because you wrote it. In order for it to get published, you have to be honest with yourself by becoming your own editor. Developing the ability of what an editor does, have that ability within you. So that way you can critique your own book and do an amazing job and get your book published as fast as possible. If you enjoyed watching this video, be sure to check out my website, where I have a tremendous number of blogs that will help you become the greatest writer you can be. In fact, I'm going to leave a link down below in the description for you to get access to my website, and you can start learning as fast as you can to become the greatest writer you can be. If you enjoyed watching this video, be sure to check out my next video on what is the toughest thing you will ever have to do in order to become a successful writer. In fact, I'm going to leave a link to that video right here. You can click on it right now and you can start learning about the toughest thing you will ever face when becoming a successful published author.